All right, let's get right into it. Today we're taking a look at a book that really challenges how we think about the 20th century. It's called Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War by Patrick Buchanan. Now, this is a pretty controversial piece of history, and our goal here is just to walk through its main arguments to explain what the book is actually claiming. The book opens with this line, which is, wow. It immediately sets this really dramatic tone of crisis and decay. The author isn't telling a story about triumph here. He's framing the 20th century as the beginning of the end for Western civilization, and you kind of have to see everything else through that lens. So here's the central idea, the big thesis. The book claims that World War I and World War II were not just unavoidable tragedies. No, it argues they were huge, preventable blunders, specifically by Britain, that ended up destroying its own empire and handing power over to America and the Soviet Union. And again, we're just here to explain that argument, not to prove it or tear it down. So to really get a grip on this, we're going to break it down into 5 parts. First, we'll look at how the book reframes the world wars. Then, we'll dive into its critique of why Britain got into World War I. Third, we'll see how it paints the Treaty of Versailles as the seed for the next war. Fourth, a really critical look at Winston Churchill. And finally, we'll unpack what the book calls the gruesome harvest of it all.
Okay, first up, this idea of the West's Great Civil War. The book's argument is that we should stop looking at 1914 to 1945 as 2 different wars. Instead, we should see it as one long, bloody, self-destructive conflict that just absolutely gutted European civilization.
To make this point, the author leans on some pretty big names, like the famous strategist George F. Cannon. The book basically takes Cannon's idea that World War I was the original catastrophe and runs with it. The argument is that this one single event kicked off a chain reaction of disasters for the rest of the century. So this is the core concept right here. In this view, this great civil war was Europe turning on itself with such incredible violence that it didn't just wreck its own empires, it also opened the door for ideologies like Nazism and communism to rush in. In short, it was a massive act of civilizational suicide.
Okay, so that leads to the next point. How did this so-called civil war even start? Well, the book puts the blame right at the feet of Great Britain for giving up its old foreign policy of splendid isolation. You know, its long-held tradition of staying out of Europe's endless squabbles.
This timeline is absolutely central to the author's case. I mean, look how quickly this happens. In just 5 years, Britain goes from being detached to being completely tangled up in a web of alliances with Japan, then France, and then, of all people, its old rival Russia. The book argues these treaties basically set the tripwires for a world war.
And the author makes it clear, this isn't just something we see with 2020 hindsight. He points to people at the time, like former Prime Minister Lord Rosebery, who were shouting from the rooftops that these alliances weren't a path to peace, but a highway straight to a massive war.
So, if getting into the war was blunder number 1, the book says the peace treaty that ended it was blunder number 2. The argument here is that the Treaty of Versailles was so harsh and so hypocritical that it basically guaranteed a second war would happen. This table does a great job of showing the book's critique. On one side, you have all these lofty ideals from President Wilson, like self-determination. But on the other side, the book argues, was a reality where millions of people were put under foreign rule and secret backroom deals were honored. It created a deep sense of betrayal. The book throws this number out there to really hammer home what it sees as Allied hypocrisy. Think about it. After fighting a war, supposedly for the rights of small nations, the British Empire got bigger by almost 1 million square miles, grabbing up old German and Ottoman lands. In this quote, well, it pretty much sums up the book's entire take on the treaty. It's using this sharp line from Lady Astor to argue that the deep resentment and humiliation that was baked into the Versailles Treaty is what created the perfect storm in Germany for someone like Adolf Hitler to rise to power.
And that brings us to the man in the title himself, Winston Churchill. Now, this is where the book gets really controversial, because it directly attacks that heroic image of Churchill we all have, and instead paints him as one of the main people pushing for these unnecessary wars. So the book presents this starkly different picture. Where we see the guy who stood up to Hitler, the author presents a die-hard imperialist who, according to his own colleagues, just didn't have good judgment. Where we celebrate his powerful speeches, the book points to what it calls poisonous language and a real hunger for a fight, right from the start. The author uses quotes just like this one from Churchill's own prime minister on the day Britain declared war in 1914 to build this case. The argument is that Churchill wasn't some reluctant hero pushed into war.
In the book's view, he was a man who consistently agitated for conflict and seemed to relish the thought of it. So, what was the final result of all this? The last part of the book's argument gets into what it calls the gruesome harvest of these two wars, basically saying that Britain's victory was so incredibly expensive, it was pretty much the same as a defeat.
I mean, just look at the scorecard. According to the book, Britain is left totally bankrupt. Its empire vanishes within a generation, global leadership gets passed to the United States, and half of Europe, including Poland, the very country Britain went to war to protect, ends up under the boot of Stalin's Soviet Union.
The author uses this really jarring quote, which is attributed to Churchill himself after the war, to suggest that even he had serious doubts about how it all turned out. The book frames this as Churchill admitting, maybe too late, that the war had just swapped one enemy for another, even more dangerous one in the East. So, if you boil it all down to one sentence, this is the author's argument. By fighting two wars it didn't need to fight, Great Britain didn't save the world. It actually destroyed its own empire and handed the keys to the planet over to new superpowers, bringing an end to centuries of European dominance.
And in the end, the book leaves us with its own title as a question. It's presenting this alternate history where different choices by British leaders could have prevented both world wars and saved their empire. It is, for sure, a provocative and pretty unsettling way to look at a history we all thought we knew.